The drawing-room at Windermere wore its age like a discreet jewel. Afternoon light, thinned to a pale gold by veils of high cloud, drifted through the long windows and made mellow spoil of the mirrors and gilding. The carpets, their colours softened and deepened by use, received the footfall as quietly as a confidant receives a confidence. Lady Constance Windermere, a slender figure whose silver hair seemed to collect and hold the light, moved from roses to chairs to a folded shawl with the art that knows when not to arrange. She stood aside and considered the impromptu stage, an Aubusson island cleared among the furniture, then glanced to the tall man by the mantel. He had been introduced often enough in that house to be part of its shifting landscape, Inspector Roderick Alleyn, whose cultivated air made him a safe guest in every sense. He was careful with Lady Constance's ornaments, her conversation, and her illusions. He looked just now like a man content to be in receipt of a pleasant afternoon, and was in fact noting where the shadows lay, how the light played on faces, and what that did to them. "It will do, don't you think?" Lady Constance said. "Hartwell has contrived an aisle for the entrance. We mustn't pretend to be the old Vic, after all." "It is better than the old Vic for your purpose," Alleyn answered, smiling. "It looks as though plays occur here by accident. Your stage manager," he nodded toward the butler in the archway, "understands the use of corners." Hartwell, that exemplar of silent service, seemed scarcely to breathe as he directed a footman with a finger and a glance. He wore the impassive mask of his trade, and yet when Lady Constance turned to him for the briefest instruction, there was a settlement about the eye, a minute assent that echoed long habit. Alleyn, who seldom mistook deference for vacancy, watched him, then let the observation sink to the storehouse of those small consistencies and smaller deviations that made up his method. They were assembling, Giles Ashford, Lady Constance's nephew and playwright, with hair that refused order and a script in his hand; Miss Diana Fairfax, upon whom the room's light dwelt approvingly; Sir Maurice Dane, immaculate from collar to shoe, his tie-pin a modest proclamation of success; Miss Viola Jesson, the pianist and would-be ingenue past the season for ingenues, her smile gentle and not without its edge. There were others on the margins, cousins and friends to fill group scenes, but these were the ones who occupied the eye and created the temperature. "The costumes came from Venice," Diana said to Giles, lifting the lid from a long, battered trunk with an eagerness that saved her from self-consciousness. "I can smell the sea, or am I imagining it?" "Seaweed and old perfume," Giles returned. "One wonders what lives in Venetian satin, history and moths." Sir Maurice reached into the trunk with careful fingers and drew out a mask. It was a handsome object, white and elongated in the style the Italians had perfected, its edges trimmed with silver thread. For a moment, held before his face, it obliterated his expression and left only that unsettling neutrality of the blank. He lowered it with a laugh that presented itself as good-humoured and was perhaps a touch too well judged. "Carnival in a drawing-room," he said. "Lady Constance, if we make any decent figure of it, it will be thanks to your encouragement and Hartwell's sanity." Lady Constance received the compliment as one receives a harmless flower, and set it in the water of her manner. "It will be thanks to Giles's writing and the energy of our young people. Do you hear that, Diana?" Diana, intent upon a mask burnished with peacock-coloured feathers and a spray of tarnished silver, looked up. "I hear you. I hope I am equal to my costume, if not my part." The bright tone was softened by something in the eyes that did not quite belong to brightness. She held the mask delicately as if it might bruise. "Its authenticity you must beware of," Miss Jesson said from the piano, where she was paging through her music with the unpersuaded attention of one who knows it by heart. "People say masks free one. I've never been convinced. They seem to me to permit all sorts of naughtiness without the bother of ownership." "It is the same thing, surely," Sir Maurice replied easily. "Freedom is sometimes a mannerly name for irresponsibility. The Venetians make a festival of that very truth." "Viola will make a moral of it," Giles said, perhaps too quickly. He wore his anxiety with an odd charm. "Shall we run the first scene? Aunt Constance, will you be so good as to sit in the middle? Diana at the window, if you please. Sir Maurice, left of the mantel. Cue on my count." The arrangement was made with a small bustle of chairs and skirts and scripts. The housewife instincts of the old room gave way with good grace to art. Alleyn retired to the back of the audience space and watched the figure who watched in turn, Hartwell, at a discreet remove near the service door. It was to Hartwell the footmen deferred, Hartwell who, without seeming to, knew where the draught ran and how to spare a lady's neck, Hartwell whose attention held as a man's will hold when he forbears to show it. Diana, in her place by the window, took a letter from the prop tray and opened it with those long, careful fingers which had not, Alleyn thought, learned their elegance in the schoolroom alone. The text was in Giles's hand, but the reading made it new. "Beware," she said, and her voice filled the space with a hushed weight. "In Venice the beautiful masks conceal the darkest hearts." It was well done. Better than one expected, and possibly better than was comfortable. A minute before, she had been a pleasing girl in a good drawing-room. Now she was a figure set apart by the intensity of her concentration. Somewhere to Alleyn's left a breath caught, no more than a thread of sound. He did not turn his head. The old oaks at the window made a reedy music against the glass. When they broke for tea, Lady Constance's relief had the lightness of a bird lifting. She shepherded them to the small table Hartwell had contrived with a conjurer's effect. Thin sandwiches, scones discreetly warm, the tea strong and forgiving. In serving, Hartwell had the serene authority of a man in his kingdom. The roses on the mantel were very lovely. A few petals had fallen and lay like small scented drops of blood on the marble. Alleyn noticed Hartwell see them, and not at once reach for them. It was, to a man of Hartwell's habit, a decision. The lamps had been brought in by the time they reached the final scene, their gentle pools of light transforming the drawing-room into something more intimate than theatrical. The October darkness pressed against the tall windows, and the old house seemed to draw its breath more quietly, as if settling into the hush that evening brings to places where much has been lived and remembered. Giles called for the masks, and they took them up with a mixture of self-consciousness and anticipation that amateur theatricals inspire. Diana lifted the peacock mask to her face with the same delicate attention she had shown that afternoon, adjusting the ribbon at the nape of her neck with careful fingers. Through the narrow eye slits, her gaze found the improvised stage, and when she spoke her first line, her voice carried a quality that had not been there in daylight, something deeper, more resonant, as if the mask had unlocked a chamber in her throat that daylight kept sealed. "The most beautiful masks," she said, reading from the letter in Giles's careful script, "conceal the darkest hearts." The words seemed to hover in the lamplight longer than words should, and Sir Maurice, waiting for his cue to approach her, hesitated for the briefest moment before moving into the scene. Miss Jesson's fingers found a minor chord on the piano, a sound that was neither quite music nor quite accident. They ran the sequence twice, and each time it grew more assured, more unsettling. The masks transformed them all, lending Sir Maurice a predatory elegance, and Miss Jesson, when she donned her silver half-mask for the ensemble piece, an air of a watchful mystery. But it was Diana who seemed most changed, as if the peacock feathers and silver thread had revealed rather than concealed some essential part of her nature. "I think that will do beautifully," Lady Constance declared when they had finished, though her voice carried a note of relief that suggested the beauty had come at some cost to her nerves. "Shall we have a brief interval? The evening is warm, and perhaps some air." The company dispersed with the grateful ease of players released from their parts. Sir Maurice stepped onto the terrace through the French doors, seeking the coolness of the October night. Miss Jesson remained at the piano, her fingers moving over the keys in fragments of melody that never quite resolved. Giles bent over his script, making notations with the fierce concentration of a young playwright who sees his vision taking shape. Lady Constance consulted with Hartwell about refreshments, their voices a comfortable murmur in the background. Diana had slipped away without announcement, taking her mask with her. To fix the ribbon properly, she had murmured to no one in particular, and the remark had been absorbed into the general settling that follows performance. The morning room, with its pier glass and comfortable chairs, had become an informal retiring room for the players, and it was natural that she should seek its privacy for the small adjustments that costumes require. 20 minutes passed before her absence began to register as something more than the ordinary need for solitude. Giles looked up from his script with the first stirring of concern. "Has anyone seen Diana? We should run through the final tableau before we lose the light entirely." Hartwell, whose awareness of the household's rhythms was as precise as clockwork, had already noted the prolonged quiet from the morning room. He moved toward it with the discretion that was his professional signature, but Alleyn, whose instincts had been gently stirring for reasons he could not yet name, followed at a distance that was neither intrusive nor accidental. The morning room received them with its familiar air of gentle welcome. The pier glass reflected the lamp from the drawing room and cast back a golden glow that should have been comforting. Diana sat in the chair before it, the peacock mask still upon her face, her hands resting in her lap with the composure of one who has found perfect peace. The ribbon at the nape of her neck was indeed properly tied, a neat bow that spoke of careful attention to detail. But there was something in her stillness that went beyond the ordinary quiet of rest. Her breathing, which should have stirred the feathers of the mask with each gentle exhale, was absent. The rise and fall of her chest, which should have marked the rhythm of life, had ceased entirely. She sat as if she had simply decided to remain in character forever, the mask transforming what should have been sleep into something far more permanent and far more troubling. Hartwell stopped, as if his feet had taken root in the carpet. His professional composure, tested by 40 years of household crises both large and small, held steady. But Alleyn saw the minute tremor in his hands and the way his breathing became carefully controlled. "Sir," he said quietly, and the single word carried the weight of terrible understanding. Alleyn moved forward with the unhurried precision that such moments require. He did not immediately touch her, but observed with the trained eye that sees what others might miss or choose not to see. The mask sat perfectly upon her face, its eye holes aligned with her closed lids, its lower edge resting just above her lips. The peacock feathers caught the lamplight and threw back tiny rainbows, beautiful and grotesque in equal measure. When he lifted the mask gently away, her face was revealed in the tranquil repose that death sometimes grants. Her lips held their natural colour, but the coolness of her skin spoke of a departure that had occurred some time ago. There was no violence written in her features, no sign of struggle or distress. She might have simply chosen to rest and found the rest too profound to abandon. The ribbon that had secured the mask lay against her throat like a dark line drawn by an artist's careful hand. It was silk, he noted, and had been drawn with sufficient precision to achieve its purpose without the crude marks that violence typically leaves. The work had been done by someone who understood both anatomy and discretion, someone who knew that death need not be theatrical to be final. "We shall need Dr. Meadows," Alleyn said quietly to Hartwell, who nodded with the relief of a man whose burden has been shared. "And we must keep the household very calm. Lady Constance should not be distressed unnecessarily until we understand what has happened here." Hartwell withdrew with the silent efficiency that was his hallmark, leaving Alleyn alone with Diana and the peacock mask that had been, both her costume and, it seemed, her shroud. The morning room held its breath around them, its mirrors reflecting nothing more dramatic than a gentleman keeping vigil with a lady who had found her final role. Outside, the October wind stirred the ancient oaks, their branches tapping against the windows with a sound like applause for a performance that had ended far too soon. He found himself thinking of the afternoon's rehearsal, of the way she had held the mask as if it were a living thing that might take flight. There had been something prophetic in her careful handling of it, something that suggested she had known, even then, that it would play a more significant part in her story than mere theatrical decoration. The ribbon lay coiled on the carpet where it had fallen, a dark serpent that had completed its work and now rested, sated and still. The roses from the drawing room had somehow found their way here as well. 2 petals lay near her feet, carried perhaps on the air or on the hem of a dress that had brushed against the mantel. He did not disturb them. They seemed, in their small way, to be keeping her company, and there was something fitting in that final courtesy. The morning room, which had witnessed so many small dramas of daily life, had become the stage for this last, most permanent performance. And like all the best performances, it left its audience with more questions than answers, and a silence that would linger long after the curtain had fallen. Alleyn did not at once impose the harsh geometry of investigation upon the morning room's gentle disorder. He had learned, through years of drawing truth from reluctant witnesses, that silence often speaks more eloquently than questions, and that the first moments after discovery hold revelations that interrogation can never recover. He stood beside Diana's chair with the composed attention of a man reading poetry, allowing the room to confess what it would in its own time and manner. Dr. Meadows arrived with the brisk discretion of a country physician who had learned to carry his black bag through drawing rooms as easily as farmhouse kitchens. His examination was thorough but conducted with the particular delicacy that death in good houses requires. When he straightened from his work, his face wore the expression of a man who had found what he had hoped not to find. "Asphyxiation," he said quietly to Alleyn, his voice pitched to carry no further than the lamplight. The ligature was applied with considerable precision, enough pressure to compress the carotid arteries without the crude violence that typically accompanies such deaths. Swift, though not instantaneous. He paused, his professional eye taking in the peaceful arrangement of the scene. "The positioning troubles me, Inspector. In cases of self-inflicted strangulation, the victim typically falls forward as consciousness departs. Miss Fairfax remains perfectly composed, as if she had been arranged with considerable care." Alleyn received this assessment with the measured attention that had served him through 20 years of similar pronouncements. His grey eyes, which had been cataloguing the room's details with the patience of a scholar, now focused on the physical evidence with renewed interest. The dark blue silk ribbon lay coiled on the carpet like a question mark, its ends cut cleanly rather than torn, its length precisely calculated for its grim purpose. The peacock mask rested on the occasional table, its feathers dulled by lamplight, the silver thread that had caught the afternoon sun now seeming tarnished and somehow complicit. From the drawing-room came the soft murmur of voices managing shock with the particular grace that good breeding requires. Alleyn could distinguish the individual tones without effort. Lady Constance's careful composure, Giles's voice tight with bewilderment, Miss Jesson's measured sympathy, Sir Maurice's deeper notes of concern. They were the sounds of people trying to impose familiar patterns upon an utterly unfamiliar situation, and in their very restraint, he heard the first whispers of secrets that would need to be coaxed into daylight. He moved through the morning room with the deliberate attention of a man reading a text in a language he was still learning to decipher. The chair had been positioned to face the pier glass, allowing its occupant to observe her reflection while adjusting the mask. The arrangement spoke of preparation rather than impulse, of ritual rather than desperation. On the small table beside Diana's chair lay the usual accessories of a lady's toilet, but something in their placement suggested they had been arranged with deliberate intention rather than casual use. When Dr. Meadows had departed with promises to expedite his formal examination, Alleyn found himself alone with his observations and the covered form in the chair. He did not immediately summon the household for questioning. Instead, he allowed his trained eye to complete its inventory of details that, once disturbed, could never be recovered. The morning room's mirrors doubled every shadow, creating the illusion of a larger, more complex geography than the simple rectangle actually contained. In their silver depths, he caught glimpses of his own reflection, moving through the space like a ghost investigating its own haunting. Hartwell appeared in the doorway with the silent materialization that was his professional signature. His face maintained its customary composure, but Alleyn, whose eye was trained to detect the minute variations in human expression, noted the tightness around the eyes, the slight compression of the lips that spoke of a man holding himself under rigid control. "Inspector," Hartwell said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that served as armour against the chaos that death brings to ordered households. "Lady Constance wonders if you might join the company in the drawing-room. They are naturally distressed, and your presence would be reassuring." Before responding, Alleyn allowed his gaze to settle on the butler with the gentle attention he might give to a valuable manuscript. "Tell me, Hartwell, Miss Fairfax seemed quite herself this afternoon during the rehearsal." "Indeed, sir, not distressed or melancholy in any particular way. She appeared to be looking forward to the performance with considerable enthusiasm." The words were chosen with the care of a man who understood that servants see much and must reveal little. Yet in the slight emphasis he placed on certain phrases, Alleyn heard the voice of someone who knew more than he was yet prepared to say. When they entered the drawing-room, Alleyn found the company arranged as if for a tableau that none of them had rehearsed. Lady Constance stood in the exact centre of her carpet, as if she had found the 1 square inch of certainty left to her. Sir Maurice remained by the French doors, an unlit cigarette held between fingers that betrayed the slightest tremor. Miss Jesson sat at the piano stool with the lid closed upon the keyboard, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that seemed almost studied. Giles occupied the arm of a chair, his script folded into an accordion of nervous creases, his eyes red where he had rubbed them. Alleyn did not immediately question them. He had learned that to speak to people at such moments was to rob them of the revealing grace period in which they showed themselves to be what they were. unguarded by the careful constructions that interrogation inevitably provokes. Instead, he offered them his quiet attention, as if it were a courtesy rather than a searchlight, and found that silence drew confessions more effectively than any amount of professional pressure. Sir Maurice's evening dress remained impeccable, yet there was a smear on his right cuff, almost invisible, which might have been velvet or powder or nothing at all. His jaw, so well schooled in charm, had set itself a fraction too firmly, and when his gaze travelled, as it inevitably did, it studiously avoided the direction of the morning-room door. Miss Jesson had removed one glove but not its mate, and the ungloved hand resting on the piano lid bore at its base a trace of something that glittered. Not jewellery, for she wore none, but a flake of silver thread. Giles worried at a small tear in his script with his thumb, and when he glanced toward the French doors there was in his look not panic but calculation, that involuntary measuring of time and distance which actors use when timing an entrance. "We shall do what is necessary," Lady Constance said, her voice acknowledging that it would be unpleasant. "Roderick, may I send for Mr. Wintermere's old solicitor? He has dealt with all our formal difficulties." "In a little while," Alleyn replied gently. "For now, if you will allow me to remain with you quietly. Sometimes in situations such as these, the most important truths emerge not from questions, but from the simple act of being together in the presence of what has happened." It was, he reflected, exactly the sort of observation that transformed a drawing-room into a confessional, and as the October wind stirred the ancient oaks beyond the windows, he settled himself to listen to the particular silence that falls upon a house where murder has been committed with all the courtesy and precision that good breeding can provide. The masks from Venice lay forgotten in their trunk, but he suspected that before this evening was over he would discover that the most revealing masks were those that had never been removed at all. The questioning began with the gentle formality of a tea-party, where unfortunate subjects must be addressed without disturbing the essential courtesies. Alleyn arranged himself in the chair that Lady Constance indicated with the air of a guest who'd been invited to linger rather than a policeman conducting interviews. This careful deception seemed to encourage the company towards something approaching natural conversation, though he noted how each speaker chose their words with the particular precision that tragedy brings to ordinary discourse. Lady Constance spoke first, as was her privilege as hostess, her voice carrying the crystalline quality that comes when one has decided to face unpleasantness with dignity and tact. Diana seemed quite herself at tea, she said, her hands folded with the composure of a woman who had weathered decades of drawing-room crises, perhaps more animated than usual, but I attributed that to excitement over the Venetian costume. She had been looking forward to wearing it with such particular pleasure. There was something in the way she lingered over the word pleasure that suggested she was remembering not just Diana's enthusiasm, but the quality of it, whether it had been simple delight or something more complex and perhaps more troubling. Her grey eyes held the particular sadness of one who realises that what had seemed charming might, in retrospect, have been significant in ways she had failed to recognise. "Were there any letters recently that might have distressed her?" Alleyn asked gently. "There are always letters when there are young people and theatricals," Lady Constance replied with careful diplomacy. "Invitations, advice, the occasional unkindness, nothing I could call menacing, though a mother did write about Diana and one of the young men. In a tone of proprietary distress, I sent a motherly reply." Giles, when invited to share his observations, spoke with the nervous precision of a young man who had suddenly discovered that his artistic creation might be implicated in genuine tragedy. "She knew her lines perfectly," he said, his fingers working at the edges of his script with unconscious agitation. During the final scene, when she spoke about masks concealing dark hearts, there was something in her delivery that made me think she understood the words differently than I had intended when I wrote them. His voice caught slightly, and Alleyn noted how his gaze moved involuntarily towards Sir Maurice, before settling on the carpet with studied tension. "Tell me about the masks themselves," Alleyn said. "You handled them this morning?" "I arranged them after they arrived from Venice. The ribbons were a muddle, so I can tie a bow properly. The peacock mask was particularly troublesome. The silk had stretched from too much threading and unthreading. I shortened it with scissors and resewed it. Not expertly, but it lay correctly." He flushed slightly. "When Diana took it up this evening, it was merely a mask. I didn't lace murder into it." Sir Maurice, when his turn came, spoke with the measured authority of a man accustomed to being believed without question. His account was precise and unrevealing. He had stepped onto the terrace for air and a cigarette, had remained there enjoying the October night, had returned to find the company distressed over Diana's absence. Yet Alleyn, whose ear was trained to detect spaces between words, heard something that did not quite ring true. The timing was too exact, the details too carefully marshalled. "Your cuff is smudged," Alleyn observed, with the casualness of one discussing etiquette. Sir Maurice examined it with faint surprise. "From the mast trunk, I expect. Venice leaves a deposit." His smile failed in its purpose. "You will discover, Inspector, that I have had better evenings. You are fond of Miss Fairfax?" "Well enough to admire her, and to avoid the appearance of admiring her too much. A balancing act at which elderly bachelors become adept. If there were rumours, I could not always hear them over the noise of my better judgment." Miss Jesson's contribution was delivered with the gentle precision of a woman who had spent years observing behaviour from the margins of social gatherings. "Diana was unusually thoughtful during the final rehearsal," she said, her voice carrying that particular sweetness which, in Alleyn's experience, often accompanied the sharpest insights. Not distressed precisely, but as if she were working through some problem that required considerable mental effort. She paused, her fingers moving over the closed piano keys with unconscious gesture. When she put on the mask for the last time, she handled it with extraordinary care, as if it were something precious or perhaps dangerous. I had the impression she was saying goodbye to something. "You noticed the silver thread on your hand," Alleyn said quietly. "I am aware of it," she replied without embarrassment. "I helped Giles with the trunk. These old costumes shed their decorations like autumn leaves. Diana had returned from Italy rather changed, you know. More guarded, perhaps. She spoke often of the masks there, how they allowed one to be utterly free yet utterly hidden. She seemed quite taken with the paradox. Hartwell, when summoned, spoke with the particular discretion that 40 years of service had refined to an art form. His testimony was precise without being revealing, comprehensive without being indiscreet. He had noted Miss Fairfax's departure to the morning room, the duration of her absence, had become concerned when it extended beyond what courtesy required. "Did you see anyone in the corridor during that time?" Alleyn asked. "I observed movement, sir. Someone passed the morning room door, though I could not say with certainty who it might have been. The light was dim, and I was attending to my duties in the drawing-room." As the October night deepened beyond the tall windows, Alleyn found himself in possession of testimony that was individually unremarkable, but collectively troubling. Each witness had provided a portrait of Diana as slightly different from her usual self, more animated, more thoughtful, more careful with the mask that had become her shroud. Yet none had seen anything that would have suggested the tragic conclusion awaiting her. The evening's questioning had given him fragments, a modified mask ribbon, traces of silver thread, a smudged cuff, the shadow of someone in the corridor. More significantly, it had revealed the careful architecture of concealment that surrounded Diana's final hours. Each member of the household had contributed pieces of a larger picture, while deliberately obscuring the connections that would make the whole comprehensible. The masks from Venice lay forgotten in their trunk, but he was beginning to understand that the most revealing disguises were those worn by the living, and that before this investigation concluded he would need to discover not just who had killed Diana Fairfax, but why the truth required such elaborate concealment from those who claimed to have cared for her. The servants' quarters at Windermere possessed that particular quality of ordered calm which marks the true governance of great houses. Here, beneath the drawing-room's elegant chaos, a different sort of authority prevailed. One built not on breeding or fortune, but on the intricate hierarchies of service that had evolved over generations like sedimentary layers of discretion and duty. Alleyn descended the narrow stairs with the careful attention such spaces demanded, understanding that he was entering a kingdom where different truths might be spoken and different silences observed. Hartwell led him through the baize door with the measured pace of a man conducting a tour of his private domain. The corridor beyond received them with its particular perfume of beeswax and starched linen, while a tall regulator clock marked time with the complacency of long service. On the wall, the bellboard gleamed softly, its neat brass labels announcing those rooms that made their demands upon the quiet industry below. Morning room, drawing room, library, terrace. Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, received them in her sitting room with the composed dignity of a woman whose authority, though exercised below stairs, was absolute within its sphere. She was perhaps 50, with a sort of handsome, weathered face that spoke of years spent managing both crises and confidences. Her grey dress was impeccable, her manner neither servile nor familiar, but something more complex, the bearing of one who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters between discretion and truth. Miss Fairfax was always pleasant to the staff, she said, when Alleyn had settled himself with the courtesy of a guest rather than an interrogator. Remembered names, inquired after families. A well-brought-up girl, though she had her particular ways. Did not favour being handled, if you understand me, Inspector. Some young ladies like to be buttoned and fussed over. Miss Fairfax preferred a mirror and her own hands. She paused, her fingers worrying at the keys that hung from her waist with the authority of office. She asked me about the morning room 3 days ago, when she came for tea with Lady Constance. Wanted to know if it was private, if one could be certain of not being disturbed there. I told her it was the quietest room in the house, that even Hartwell rarely entered, unless specifically summoned. She seemed pleased by that information. Did she say why she needed such privacy? Alleyn asked gently. She spoke of correspondence requiring careful consideration, but there was something in her manner, not distress exactly, but the sort of purposefulness that comes when one has made a difficult decision. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice carried the particular weight of one who had observed human nature from the margins for decades. I had the impression she was preparing for something, though I could not have said what. Young Mary, the housemaid, appeared in the doorway with the hesitant manner of one who knows she possesses information, but fears the consequences of sharing it. She was perhaps 18, with fresh country prettiness, and the careful deportment of one still learning the intricate rules of service in a great house. "I was turning down the beds yesterday evening," she said, when encouraged to speak, "when I heard voices in the corridor outside the morning room. Not raised voices, but serious ones. Miss Fairfax was speaking with someone, though I couldn't make out the words clearly through the door. Could you identify the other voice?" Mary's hands twisted in her apron with the nervous gesture of one who had been taught that servants should not listen to their betters' conversations. "It was a gentleman, sir, speaking very quietly, very urgently. There was something in the tone, not angry but insistent, as if he were trying to convince her of something important. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped quite suddenly, and I heard footsteps moving away toward the main staircase. When you passed the morning room later," Alleyn continued, "did you observe anything else?" "Yes, sir. I saw Miss Fairfax through the partially open door. She was sitting before the mirror, holding that peacock mask. But she wasn't looking at her reflection. She was staring at the mask itself, as if it were telling her something. Her face was very still, very sad. I thought perhaps she had received troubling news." Hartwell, who had remained silent during these exchanges, now moved to the pantry where silver gleamed under discreet electric light. His domain was order itself, a place where the rituals of service continued with sacred indifference to the disarray of human emotion. When Alleyn joined him there, the butler spoke with the measured precision that was his professional signature. "You mentioned earlier that you observed someone pass the morning-room door," Alleyn said. "Could you elaborate on that observation?" Hartwell paused in his polishing, a silver fork held poised above a buffing cloth. "A definite presence, sir, a figure moving with purposefulness, from the direction of the main hall toward the service corridor. Or perhaps the reverse. The perspective from my position was not entirely clear on that point." His phrasing was meticulous, yet Alleyn detected a faint hesitation, the carefulness of a witness who presents facts with studied neutrality. "The timing?" "Between 1:15 and 20 minutes past the hour, sir. Just after Miss Fairfax had retired to the morning room, and before Mr. Ashford began to inquire as to her whereabouts." Hartwell's internal clock was clearly as precise as the grandfather clock in the hall. "There is something else," Hartwell continued, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for confidences. "The side door to... The garden had been unbolted after tea for airing. I rebolted it at 7:30. Before that, someone used it. The bolt was drawn and later set home again." Alleyn absorbed this information with the careful attention it deserved. "And the morning room itself, did you notice anything unusual about its condition?" "The window, sir, it was ajar, perhaps 3 inches. Miss Fairfax usually preferred it closed in the evening, as she was susceptible to draughts. I had closed it myself earlier in the afternoon, yet when I found her it stood open." The second footman, Henry, was summoned from his duties and stood with the anxious posture of one unaccustomed to official attention. "Sir Maurice asked for a light on the terrace," he said when questioned. "I had none. Matches had been mislaid from the side table. I went to fetch them, but when I returned, Sir Maurice was at the drawing-room door. He said he had changed his mind." "No matter, my boy," he said. But he was not himself. He sounded as if he'd forgotten what he'd asked me. Mrs. Dalrymple produced, with evident reluctance, the sewing tray kept for household emergencies. Its contents were unremarkable. Cotton thread, steel pins, a small sharp pair of scissors that gleamed with the particular brightness of well-maintained tools. "Mr. Ashford borrowed the scissors after luncheon," she said. "To trim a ribbon he had sewn untidily. He returned them in good order. Miss Jesson had the bodkin earlier for rethreading braid on one of the costume sleeves. I did not see her return it." "And Miss Fairfax borrowed nothing?" "She did not ask me, sir. If she wrote a note, she did it with her own implements. She kept a small writing case about her person. Neat, like a lady who travels." Mrs. Dalrymple paused, then added with careful precision, "Though Jenkins mentioned taking a letter to the post for her yesterday afternoon. Foreign direction," he said, with strange writing like copying from a starred page. There was a V in it, he remembered, with a tail like a fish. When they returned to the drawing-room, Alleyn carried with him a collection of observations that, individually, might seem unremarkable, but collectively painted a picture of careful preparation and deliberate concealment. The servants had given him what they could without betraying the deeper loyalties that bound them to the household. A Diana who had planned her final encounter with considerable care, who had sought privacy for purposes that remained unclear, and who had conducted serious conversations with unidentified visitors in the hours before her death. Most significantly, their testimony suggested that what had appeared to be a moment of tragic impulse might instead have been the culmination of days or weeks of preparation. The morning room had not been chosen randomly but deliberately, for reasons that connected childhood memories to adult necessities. The mask had been more than theatrical property. It had been contemplated, studied, perhaps even rehearsed with. The household's understanding ran deeper than their words revealed. They knew that Miss Fairfax did not invite hands to her throat, yet someone had been permitted there. They had noted movement in corridors and the careful manipulation of doors and windows. They had observed the dispatch of urgent correspondence and the modification of costume ribbons with purposes that transcended mere theatrical necessity. It was as much as the servants would give him, delivered with the particular discretion that marks those who serve great houses and understand that loyalty sometimes requires the careful management of truth rather than its immediate revelation. Yet in the pattern of their observations, Alleyn found exactly what he needed: the outline of a tragedy that had been choreographed as carefully as any theatrical performance, with masks that concealed far more than Venetian Carnival had ever intended. The morning light, filtered through the tall windows of Windermere, possessed that particular quality which transforms familiar objects into evidence, lending significance to details that darkness had obscured. Alleyn returned to the morning room with the measured attention of a scholar approaching a text that had revealed new meanings overnight. The space received him with its customary grace, though the draped chair before the pier glass served as a constant reminder that some performances once concluded can never be repeated. He moved first to the occasional table where the peacock mask lay in elegant repose, its feathers catching the morning light with a beauty that seemed almost mocking in its persistence. Beside it, coiled with deceptive innocence, lay the dark blue silk ribbon that had served such a different purpose than theatrical decoration. Alleyn lifted it with the careful attention that such evidence demands, allowing the silk to run through his fingers like a confession reluctantly given. The ribbon told its story to those trained to read such narratives. Near its centre he detected a subtle stiffening that spoke of treatment, with some substance foreign to silk's natural properties. When he held the length to the light, certain sections revealed a faint glaze that distinguished them from the ribbon's natural lustre. The alteration was precise, deliberate, applied in two carefully measured spans approximately an inch in length, and positioned opposite one another like the grips of practised hands. Beeswax, he murmured to himself, recognizing the particular quality that household management had lent to the silk. It was a substance as familiar to the running of great houses as silver polish or furniture wax, kept in every housekeeper's arsenal for the countless small repairs that domestic life requires. Yet its application to this ribbon served a purpose far removed from ordinary mending. Mrs. Dalrymple, when summoned with the courtesy that such consultations require, confirmed his suspicions with the resigned air of one whose professional domain had been invaded by tragedy. "The cake shows recent use," she acknowledged, indicating the pale yellow block of beeswax in her sewing tray. "2 grooves, set apart as you describe. I was called away to the still room before dinner, perhaps 10 minutes. When I returned, everything appeared as I had left it, though." She paused, her housekeeper's instincts detecting disturbances too subtle for casual observation. "Though someone had borrowed without asking," Alleyn completed gently. "In good houses, Inspector, people ask first, but there are those who move between stairs with sufficient familiarity to consider such courtesies unnecessary." The significance of the wax treatment became clear when Alleyn experimented with the ribbon's behaviour. Untreated silk, when tied, maintains a certain willingness to slide and adjust, allowing knots to be loosened or tightened with relative ease. The waxed sections, however, gripped with decisive finality, transforming what should have been a manageable bow into something that tightened irreversibly once tension was applied. A lady accustomed to managing her own ribbons and bows would immediately notice such uncharacteristic behaviour in her materials. Yet Diana had not struggled against the ribbon's altered nature. More revealing still was the manner in which the final bow had been tied. Alleyn had observed, during his years of drawing-room investigations, that personal habits in such matters are as distinctive as signatures. When a lady ties a ribbon at her own throat, using a mirror to guide her movements, the mechanics of the action create a bow with a particular orientation, the loops lying on a specific axis determined by the reversed perspective that reflection imposes. When a valet or lady's maid performs the same service standing behind the subject, the resulting bow displays a different geometry entirely. The bow that had secured Diana's mask bore the unmistakable characteristics of the latter method. Loops lying perfectly horizontal, the first throw executed with the practiced precision of trained hands, the final result displaying that particular symmetry which comes only from years of dressing others. It was, Alleyn realised, the signature of someone whose fingers had learned their skill in service to the theatrical arts, where the proper securing of costumes and masks required both technical proficiency and aesthetic sensibility. "The knot itself is most instructive," he observed to Hartwell when the butler appeared with his customary discretion. "It is a variation of what theatrical people call a slip hitch, designed to hold firmly under tension, yet release cleanly when properly manipulated. Not common knowledge, but essential in the world of stage management where draperies and costumes must be secured quickly and released without damage." Hartwell received this information with the composed attention that such revelations required. "Several members of the household possess theatrical experience, sir. The Amateur Dramatic Society has been Lady Constance's particular interest for many years." The morning room yielded additional evidence of careful preparation when examined with proper attention to domestic detail. The chair before the pier glass had been repositioned slightly forward and to the left, its back caster resting upon a folded fragment of the theatrical programme. The improvised shim bore a notation in feminine handwriting: "Window, 3 inches," referring to the precise gap that had been maintained in the casement to ensure proper ventilation during what must have been a carefully timed encounter. The writing desk revealed its own secrets. A half-finished letter in Diana's hand, abandoned mid-sentence with the pen lying beside a small blot of ink that suggested sudden interruption. The visible portion spoke of discoveries made in Venice, and truths that had become both necessary and impossible to reveal. Beneath the blotter, the faint impressions of previous correspondence could be discerned. Words like "final warning" and "exposure" pressed into the paper with the force of strong emotion. Most significantly, the matches that should have been available on both the terrace table and the writing desk had been systematically removed, leaving only a faint crescent of soot on the wood where something had been briefly heated. The mark, when examined closely, showed traces of the same beeswax that had treated the ribbon, suggesting that the substance had been warmed to ensure smooth application. As Alleyn assembled these details into a coherent narrative, the morning room's atmosphere seemed to darken with the weight of premeditation. Diana's death had not been the result of sudden passion or desperate impulse, but rather the culmination of careful planning that had transformed the familiar rituals of theatrical preparation into instruments of murder. The killer had possessed intimate knowledge of both the household's routines and the technical requirements of stagecraft, using this expertise to create a tableau that would appear to be suicide while concealing the methodical precision of homicide. The peacock mask, with its elaborate feathers and silver threading, had been chosen not merely for its beauty but for its symbolic appropriateness, a final, cruel commentary on the themes of concealment and revelation that had dominated the evening's rehearsal. The ribbon that had secured it bore the invisible marks of preparation that transformed theatrical property into lethal instrument, while the knot that bound it displayed the professional competence of hands trained in the precise arts of costume and staging. Standing in the morning light that revealed so much while concealing nothing, Alleyn understood that he was confronting not merely a crime of violence, but a performance of the most sinister sort, one in which the victim had been transformed into an unwilling participant in her own destruction, and the familiar comforts of domestic routine had been perverted into the machinery of murder. The investigation had moved beyond the realm of simple detection into the more complex territory of theatrical criticism, where the most important truths lay not in what was performed, but in the careful preparation that made the performance possible. The morning room, which had witnessed Diana's final moments, now served as the stage for a different sort of revelation, one in which the careful observation of domestic detail would ultimately expose the hand that had directed this most tragic of performances. And like all the best theatrical productions, it would require not just technical skill to unravel, but an understanding of the human motivations that had transformed art into atrocity. The morning at Wintermere possessed that particular quality of suspended animation which follows the discovery that familiar certainties have been undermined by careful malice. The household moved through their customary routines with the heightened awareness of actors who had suddenly realized they were performing in a drama whose script they had not been permitted to read. Alleyn, observing from the library where he had established his temporary headquarters, noted how each member of the company seemed to carry themselves with just slightly more precision than natural ease would require. It was Miss Jesson who provided the first indication that the morning's calm was deceptive. She appeared in the drawing-room shortly after 11, her usual composure fractured by an agitation that she struggled to contain within the bounds of good breeding. In her hands she carried a letter, its envelope bearing the distinctive watermark of expensive Italian stationery, its contents having clearly disturbed her equilibrium in ways that went beyond ordinary correspondence. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying that particular tremor which accompanies the discovery of unpleasant truths, "I believe this may be relevant to your investigation. It arrived with yesterday's evening post, though I confess I had not the courage to open it until this morning. It was written some weeks ago, during Diana's stay in Venice. The letter, when Alleyn examined it with appropriate care, proved to be written in Diana's hand, though in a script that betrayed considerable emotional distress. The paper itself was of Italian manufacture, bearing the embossed crest of a Venetian hotel that catered to the more discriminating class of English traveller. The date showed it to have been composed 3 weeks prior to Diana's death, during what Lady Constance had described as a restorative holiday following a disappointing romantic attachment. "My dearest Viola," the letter began, "I write to you because you alone among my friends possess the wisdom to understand the complexity of the situation in which I find myself. Venice has shown me truths that I had not expected to discover, and I fear that my return to England will require me to act upon knowledge that may destroy the peace of those I care for most." The letter continued with increasing urgency, describing encounters with an unnamed English gentleman whose presence in Venice had transformed what should have been a period of healing into something far more troubling. "He is not what he appears to be in London," Diana had written, "and the discovery of his true nature has placed me in a position where silence would be complicity, yet revelation would be devastating. I have evidence that would ruin him utterly, yet he believes himself safe behind the mask of respectability that English society provides." As if summoned by the gravity of these discoveries, Sir Maurice appeared in the drawing-room, with the punctuality of one whose internal clock had been calibrated by decades of social obligation. His morning dress was impeccable as always, yet Alleyn noted a tightness around the eyes that spoke of a night spent in contemplation rather than rest. When informed of the letter's contents in the most general terms, Sir Maurice received the news with composed attention, though his hands, resting on the arm of his chair, betrayed the slightest tremor. "Poor Diana," he said, his voice carrying exactly the right note of sympathetic regret. "Venice can be overwhelming for sensitive natures, The combination of beauty and decay affects people differently. Diana was always susceptible to impressions. Yet even as he spoke these carefully modulated words, Alleyn observed how Sir Maurice's gaze moved involuntarily toward the morning room door, and when Miss Jesson mentioned Diana's reference to compromising evidence, his reaction was immediate and instinctive, a swift intake of breath, quickly controlled, followed by the sort of careful stillness that comes when one realizes that a long-dreaded moment has finally arrived. The morning's second disturbance arrived with Hartwell's customary discretion. The butler appeared in the drawing-room carrying a small cream-coloured envelope with the delicate formality usually reserved for priceless artefacts. "Inspector," he said, his voice a low, even murmur, "Lady Constance has asked me to deliver this to you at once. It was discovered this morning, tucked into a volume of poetry on Miss Fairfax's bedside table." The envelope was unsealed, addressed simply, "To whom it may concern," in what appeared to be Diana's elegant hand. The paper was of fine quality, faintly scented with lavender, bearing the watermark of the stationery found in her writing case. Yet as Alleyn drew out the single sheet within, his trained eye immediately detected subtle inconsistencies that transformed apparent authenticity into calculated deception. "My dearest friends," the letter began, "and those who may wonder at this final, desperate act. The masks I have worn, both on the stage and in life, have become too heavy to bear. In Venice, I sought a freedom that proved to be an illusion, a deeper concealment rather than a true liberation. Forgive me the pain I cause, but the silence I seek is a peace I can no longer live without." The prose was elegant, almost poetic, echoing the themes of Giles's play with unsettling resonance. It spoke of despair and hidden depths, with all the fashionable anxieties of a sensitive young woman. On the surface, it provided a neat explanation for Diana's death, transforming suspicious circumstances into a case of self-inflicted sorrow. It was, in its own way, a perfect final curtain. Too perfect, Alleyn reflected, examining the letter with the methodical attention that such documents required. While the handwriting bore Diana's characteristic slope and spacing, the formation of certain letters revealed subtle variations that spoke of careful imitation rather than natural flow. The long-tailed Y that had been Diana's particular signature appeared shortened and constrained. More tellingly, the pressure of the pen was heaviest at the ends of words rather than the beginnings, the reverse of her usual economy of motion. "Hartwell," Alleyn said quietly, "did Miss Fairfax often write in such a composed manner when deeply distressed?" "Miss Fairfax was a young lady of considerable refinement, sir," Hartwell replied with careful neutrality. "However, I recall her mother once remarking that Diana's most heartfelt sentiments were often expressed with considerable impetuosity, a less formal hand when deeply moved. The letter's literary quality was perhaps its most damning characteristic. The careful construction of paragraphs, the theatrical echoing of the play's themes, the polished articulation of despair, all suggested the work of someone who thought in dramatic terms rather than the spontaneous outpouring of genuine anguish. It was a performance, not a confession, crafted by hands that understood both Diana's writing style and the conventions of tragic correspondence. As the implications of this second deception settled upon the drawing-room, Alleyn observed how the careful choreography of morning routines began to fracture under the weight of accumulated lies. The discovery of the forged note, rather than providing closure, had merely added another layer to an increasingly complex architecture of concealment. Someone among this polite company possessed not only the motive and opportunity for murder, but the cold calculation necessary to forge a dead woman's final words. The household's tension, which had been the low hum of shock and grief, now escalated into something sharper and more focused. The silence that followed the letter's examination was no longer merely respectful. It was charged with the unspoken understanding that they were all now participants in a performance whose script called for one of them to be revealed as both playwright and principal actor in a tragedy that had claimed Diana's life and threatened to destroy the careful illusions upon which their world depended. Standing by the tall windows where October light revealed every detail with merciless clarity, Alleyn understood that the morning's revelations had fundamentally transformed his investigation. The masks from Venice, which had seemed merely exotic accessories to amateur theatricals, were now revealed as symbols of a deception that extended far beyond the boundaries of artistic pretense. The stage had been reset, the players repositioned, and the final act was about to begin in earnest. The afternoon at Windermere had settled into that particular quality of suspended quiet, which follows the recognition that familiar certainties have been fundamentally disturbed. Alleyn remained in the library's leather embrace, allowing the accumulated evidence to arrange itself in his mind, with the patient precision that such cases required. Outside, the October light possessed that crystalline clarity, which transforms ordinary objects into testimony, lending significance to details that morning shadows had obscured. The forged suicide note lay before him on the writing desk, its cream-coloured elegance a study in calculated deception. When examined with proper attention, the document revealed its true nature through a dozen small betrayals. The literary sophistication that genuine despair rarely achieves, the careful echoing of theatrical themes, the handwriting that mimicked Diana's letter forms while missing the natural flow of her pen. Most damning was the paper itself, stationery bearing her monogram yet manufactured after her departure for Venice, written with ink that showed no trace of her characteristic violet preference. It was authenticity's perfect counterfeit, crafted by hands that understood both Diana's habits and the conventions of tragic correspondence. The physical evidence told its own inexorable story. The silk ribbon, with its precise application of beeswax at measured intervals, spoke of premeditation that went far beyond ordinary criminal planning. The wax had transformed pliable silk into something that would grip with decisive finality once tension was applied, yet the modification required intimate knowledge of both domestic materials and their behaviour under stress. The knot itself, a theatrical slip hitch tied from behind with professional competence, revealed hands trained in the precise arts of costume and staging. More revealing still was the careful choreography of the scene. The chair positioned to face the pier glass, the window open to exactly 3 inches, the systematic removal of matches from their customary stations. Each detail spoke of a mind that planned in measurements rather than impulses. The scrap of programme beneath the chair's caster, bearing the notation "window 3 inches", in handwriting similar to Diana's yet subtly different in its formation, was perhaps the most telling evidence of all. It was a staging direction, not woman's preference for air. As these realizations crystallized, Alleyn found himself studying not just the mechanics of murder but its psychology. The killer possessed that dangerous combination of technical competence and moral blindness, which transforms legitimate skills into instruments of evil. They had moved through Windermere's familiar landscape with the confidence of one whose position provided both opportunity and invisibility, using the household's routines and materials as tools in a deadly craft. The motive, when properly understood, revealed itself to be as carefully constructed as the crime itself. Diana's letters from Venice spoke of discoveries that could ruin him utterly, of evidence that was both necessary and impossible to reveal. Her return to England had brought with it knowledge that threatened to destroy carefully maintained illusions. The killer had acted not from sudden passion, but from the cold calculation of self-preservation, eliminating a threat that could not be neutralized through any other means. The theatrical nature of the crime was undeniable. The choice of the peacock mask, the precise staging of Diana's final pose, the forged note that would have forever distorted her memory, all spoke of someone who saw life itself as a performance requiring careful management. This was not merely murder, but a complete theft of narrative, an attempt to control not only Diana's death but the manner in which she would be remembered. Individual behaviours now took on their proper significance. The silver thread at the base of Miss Jesson's ungloved hand, the missing bodkin from the sewing tray, the single glove removed with the unconscious efficiency of one whose fingers had learned their skill in service to theatrical arts. Her gentle observations about masks and concealment, delivered with that particular sweetness which often accompanies the sharpest insights, now revealed themselves as something more complex than mere commentary. Sir Maurice's studied avoidance of the morning-room door, his momentary lapse when confronted with talk of evidence, the almost invisible smudge on his cuff, these were the reactions of a man whose carefully constructed facade had been threatened with exposure. Yet his role, Alleyn realized, was that of catalyst rather than perpetrator, the unnamed English gentleman whose Venetian indiscretions had set this tragedy in motion. The household's rhythm, which Hartwell maintained with such devoted precision, had been violated by someone who understood its patterns intimately enough to use them as camouflage. The unbolted garden door, the movement in corridors during the crucial interval, the careful timing that provided alibis for the innocent while creating opportunity for the guilty, all spoke of intimate familiarity with Windermere's domestic geography. As the afternoon light began its slow retreat beyond the tall windows, Alleyn found himself in possession of not merely a solution, but an understanding of the human capacity for transforming protective instincts into destructive ones. The killer had acted from love as much as self-interest, eliminating a threat to someone whose happiness had become the organizing principle of their existence. It was a crime born of devotion perverted into possessiveness, of service transformed into something far more sinister. The time approached when silence would no longer serve justice, when the careful architecture of concealment would need to be dismantled with the same precision that had constructed it. Yet for now, Alleyn allowed the weight of knowledge to settle like dust over his understanding, defining edges rather than obscuring them. The drawing room at Windermere, which had witnessed so many polite deceptions and social comedies, would soon host its most serious drama, one in which the final revelation would transform familiar faces into studies in guilt and innocence, and the comfortable certainties of domestic life would be forever altered by the exposure of truth that lay beneath its elegant surface. He rose from his chair with the measured deliberation of a man who had read a complex text to its conclusion, and now prepared to share its meaning with those who had lived within its pages without understanding its true significance. The masks from Venice lay forgotten in their trunk, but the most revealing disguise was about to be removed at last. The music room at Windermere possessed that particular quality of intimate discretion which made it suitable for conversations that required both privacy and dignity. The late afternoon light fell across the silenced piano with gentle authority, while the closed lid reflected nothing more than the careful arrangement of 2 chairs positioned for serious discourse rather than interrogation. Miss Jesson entered with her customary composure, though Alleyn noted how her fingers worried at the single glove she had removed, a gesture that spoke of nerves held under rigid control. "You wish to speak privately," she said, settling herself with the precise attention to posture that years of drawing-room discipline had instilled. "I confess I am grateful for the courtesy. Public revelations have a way of transforming private truths into theatrical spectacles." Alleyn arranged himself in the companion chair, with the careful attention to angles that such moments required, positioning himself as confidant rather than adversary. "It is the private truth I seek, Miss Jesson. The performance in the morning room yesterday evening was expertly managed, but like all performances, it reveals as much about its director as its apparent subject." Her grey eyes, which had observed so much from the margins of social gatherings, met his with steady attention. "I have spent 15 years arranging performances for Lady Constance's benefit. Amateur theatricals require considerable attention to detail if they are to achieve their intended effect." "Indeed, they do." Alleyn's voice carried the measured courtesy that such conversations demanded. The ribbon that secured Miss Fairfax's mask, for instance, had been treated with beeswax at precisely measured intervals. Mrs. Dalrymple's cake shows the grooves where someone warmed the substance for smooth application. The modification transformed pliable silk into something that would grip with decisive finality once tension was applied. Miss Jesson's hands stilled in her lap, though her composure remained intact. "Beeswax serves many purposes in household management, Inspector. It mends what would otherwise fray or slip." "The knot itself tells an even more specific story," Alleyn continued with gentle persistence. "A theatrical slip hitch, tied from behind with professional competence. When ladies secure their own ribbons using a mirror, the mechanics create a different geometry entirely. The bow that bound Miss Fairfax's mask bears the unmistakable signature of hands trained in dressing others, the precise horizontal alignment that comes only from years of costume management." The silence that followed was not empty but weighted with recognition. Miss Jesson's fingers moved unconsciously to the base of her thumb, where the silver thread from the peacock mask had left its telltale trace. When she spoke, her voice carried that crystalline quality which had made her observations so memorable throughout the investigation. "You're remarkably thorough, Inspector. Yes, I tied the bow." Diana had requested assistance with the mask's proper adjustment, a service she naturally accepted from someone she trusted. The ribbon had become troublesome during the afternoon's handling, and I offered to demonstrate a technique that would ensure secure fastening without the risk of slippage during performance. Yet the performance that followed was not the one she had anticipated, Alleyn observed quietly. The forged suicide note, written on her stationery with careful imitation of her hand, suggests a different sort of theatrical conclusion. The literary sophistication betrays its artificial nature. Genuine despair rarely achieves such polished articulation. Miss Jesson's composure wavered for the first time, a slight compression of the lips that spoke of internal struggle. Diana had returned from Venice much changed, Inspector. The discoveries she made there had transformed her from a charming girl into something more dangerous, a young woman convinced of her moral duty to expose uncomfortable truths regardless of the consequences. The truth concerning Sir Maurice's activities during his Italian sojourn, Alleyn said with careful neutrality. His romantic entanglements with wealthy widows, the financial arrangements that had supported his elegant lifestyle, the correspondence that would have ruined him utterly if brought to light. She possessed letters, Inspector, copies made with the methodical precision of one who intended to use them. Sir Maurice had been indiscreet in ways that went beyond mere romantic foolishness. There were financial implications, questions of character that would have destroyed not only his reputation, but his ability to move in the society that had sustained him for decades. Miss Jesson rose and moved to the piano, her fingers resting on the closed keyboard with unconscious familiarity. Diana spoke of justice, of the necessity of exposure, of her duty to protect other vulnerable women from his calculated charm. She could not see, or chose not to see, that such revelations would destroy more than their intended target. Lady Constance, Alleyn said with understanding. Lady Constance has been the organising principle of my existence for 15 years, Miss Jesson replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Her happiness, her peace of mind, her protection from those who would exploit her generous nature, these became more important to me than my own comfort, certainly more important than Diana's sense of moral obligation. The confession, when it came, was delivered with the same composed attention that Miss Jesson had brought to all her duties at Wintermere. I followed her to the morning room during the interval, offering assistance with the mask that she had found troublesome. The waxed ribbon behaved exactly as I had calculated, gripping with irreversible finality once proper tension was applied. Diana realised what was happening, but the physics of the situation had moved beyond her control. You held her hands, Alleyn said gently, while the mask completed its work. I spoke to her of Venice, of the beauty of final performances, of the peace that comes when one no longer needs to choose between conflicting loyalties. She did not suffer unduly, Inspector. The knot was designed for swift efficiency rather than prolonged distress. The music room held its breath around them, the piano's silence somehow more profound than any melody it might have produced. Miss Jesson returned to her chair with the careful dignity of one whose burden had been shared and found, if not lighter, then at least no longer solitary. The forged note was composed later, after I had arranged her in the chair with appropriate dignity. I used her writing materials, imitating her hand with the skill that comes from years of observing correspondence. The literary quality was unavoidable. I think in dramatic terms construct sentences with the precision that theatrical involvement requires. Alleyn absorbed this final piece of the puzzle with the quiet attention it deserved. You regret the necessity, but not the choice. I regret that Diana's moral certainty left me no alternative. She would have destroyed Lady Constance's faith in human goodness, her belief that the world contains more kindness than calculation. Some truths, Inspector, are too harsh for generous hearts to bear. The October light had begun its retreat beyond the tall windows, leaving the music room in that particular twilight which transforms familiar spaces into theatres of memory. Miss Jesson sat with her hands properly folded, her composure restored to its customary perfection, a woman who had acted from love so profound that it had transformed itself into something far more dangerous than hatred. There will be formalities, Alleyn said, rising with the same measured courtesy he had maintained throughout their conversation. I have been managing formalities all my life, Inspector, she replied, with a slight smile that contained no humour but considerable dignity. I shall not fail at the last, though I confess, for a woman who has spent her existence arranging others' performances, there is a curious satisfaction in finally taking centre stage, even if the role proves to be a tragic one. The music room, which had witnessed so many pleasant afternoons of amateur musical entertainment, now held the echo of a different sort of performance, one in which the most beautiful mask had indeed concealed the darkest heart, and love itself had become the instrument of its own destruction. The drawing-room at Windermere had arranged itself with that particular gravity which attends moments when familiar certainties must be permanently altered. The October evening had drawn the curtains of dusk across the tall windows, and the lamps cast their gentle pools of light over a company that had unconsciously positioned itself for revelation rather than conversation. Lady Constance occupied her customary chair by the mantelpiece, her silver hair catching the firelight as she maintained the composed dignity that had carried her through decades of drawing-room crises. The roses on the mantel had shed more petals, their scattered fragments like small, silent witnesses to the day's tragic discoveries. Sir Maurice stood near the French doors with studied casualness, though Alleyn noted how his gaze avoided the direction of the morning-room with almost mathematical precision. Giles remained by the piano, his abandoned script a reminder of how thoroughly reality had overtaken theatrical invention. Miss Jesson entered last, moving with that measured grace which had characterised all her years at Windermere, taking her place near the piano stool with the natural authority of one whose position had never been questioned, though it would soon be understood in entirely different terms. Alleyn did not at once impose the harsh geometry of accusation upon the drawing-room's gentle atmosphere. Instead, he allowed the evidence to accumulate like evening shadows, each detail settling into place with the inexorable weight of truth revealed. "The investigation into Miss Fairfax's death," he began, his voice carrying the measured courtesy that such moments demanded, "has revealed circumstances that transform what appeared to be tragic impulse into something far more calculated and complex." He moved to the occasional table where the forged suicide note lay beneath the lamplight, its cream-coloured elegance a study in careful deception. This letter, ostensibly Miss Fairfax's final confession, displays a literary sophistication that genuine despair rarely achieves. The handwriting, while skillfully imitative, lacks the natural impetuosity that Lady Constance observed in Diana's moments of authentic distress. More significantly, the paper itself, though bearing her monogram, was manufactured after her departure for Venice, written with standard black ink rather than her characteristic violet preference. Lady Constance's hands tightened almost imperceptibly upon the arms of her chair, though her composure remained intact. "You are certain there can be no error, Inspector?" "The physical evidence is conclusive," Alleyn replied gently. The silk ribbon that secured Miss Fairfax's mask had been treated with beeswax at precisely measured intervals, transforming pliable silk into something that would grip with irreversible finality once tension was applied. Mrs. Dalrymple's cake shows the twin grooves where the substance was warmed for smooth application. The modification required intimate knowledge of both domestic materials and their behaviour under stress. He lifted the dark blue ribbon, allowing its length to fall with deceptive innocence. The knot itself tells an even more specific story, a theatrical slip hitch, tied from behind with professional competence. When ladies secure their own ribbons using a mirror, the mechanics create a different geometry entirely. The bow that bound Miss Fairfax's mask bears the unmistakable signature of hands trained in dressing others, the precise horizontal alignment that comes only from years of costume management. The silence that followed was not empty, but weighted with recognition. Miss Jesson's fingers moved unconsciously to the base of her thumb, where the silver thread from the peacock mask had left its telltale trace. When she spoke, her voice carried that crystalline quality which had made her observations so memorable throughout the investigation. "You are remarkably thorough, Inspector." Her grey eyes, which had observed so much from the margins of social gatherings, met his with steady attention. "Yes, I assisted Diana with the mask's adjustment. She had requested help with the troublesome ribbon, a service she naturally accepted from someone she trusted. Yet the assistance provided was not what she had anticipated," Alleyn observed quietly. Miss Fairfax had returned from Venice with knowledge that threatened to destroy carefully maintained illusions. She possessed correspondence that would have exposed uncomfortable truths about activities during Sir Maurice's Italian sojourn, activities that went beyond romantic indiscretion, into territory that would have ruined him utterly if brought to light. Sir Maurice's carefully maintained facade cracked visibly, revealing beneath it the features of a man whose long-dreaded reckoning had finally arrived. Yet it was not toward him that attention naturally turned, but toward Miss Jesson, who sat with her hands properly folded and her gaze fixed upon Lady Constance with an expression of profound tenderness. Diana spoke of justice, Miss Jesson said, her voice maintaining its customary gentleness despite the gravity of her admission. Of moral duty, of the necessity of exposure, of her obligation to protect other vulnerable women from calculated charm. She could not see, or chose not to see, that such revelations would destroy more than their intended target. Lady Constance's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "You killed her to protect me." "I killed her to protect your faith in human goodness," Miss Jesson corrected with gentle precision. "Your belief that the world contains more kindness than calculation, more genuine affection than strategic manipulation. Diana's revelations would have shattered those illusions, leaving you to question every friendship, every gesture of regard, every expression of care that had brought meaning to your existence." The confession, when it came in full, was delivered with the same composed attention that Miss Jesson had brought to all her duties at Windermere. She described the careful preparation, the waxed ribbon that would grip without release, the positioning of the chair to face the pier glass, the systematic removal of matches to prevent any possibility of escape. She spoke of holding Diana's hands while the mask completed its work, of composing the forged note with the literary skill that theatrical involvement had refined, of arranging the scene with the same attention to detail she had always brought to Lady Constance's comfort. "I regret the necessity but not the choice," she concluded quietly. "Some truths are too harsh for generous hearts to bear. I have lived in your house, Constance, and seen the harm that charming men can do when women are generous enough to assume the best of them. I believed, perhaps wrongly, that to spare you such ugliness was worth any price." The October wind stirred the ancient oaks beyond the tall windows, their branches tapping against the glass with a sound like whispered farewells. Lady Constance reached toward Miss Jesson, with the instinctive gesture of one seeking comfort from a trusted companion, then withdrew her hand as the full implications settled upon her understanding. "All these years," she murmured, "you have been protecting me from truths I never knew existed." "All these years," Miss Jesson agreed. "I have been arranging your life as carefully as I arrange your theatrical productions, ensuring that unpleasant realities remained hidden behind beautiful performances. Diana threatened to tear down the curtain and reveal the machinery that creates the illusion. I could not permit that destruction." The formal conclusion followed with the inevitable weight of legal necessity, though it was conducted with all the courtesy that such circumstances would allow. Miss Jesson would face her fate with the same composed attention she had brought to all her duties at Windermere, while the household around her struggled to comprehend how devotion so profound could transform itself into something so deadly. As the evening deepened beyond the tall windows and the ancient house settled into its familiar rhythms, the drawing-room at Windermere held the echo of a truth more complex than any theatrical performance could contain. The masks from Venice lay forgotten in their trunk, but the most revealing disguise had been worn not by the victim, but by the killer. The mask of perfect service concealing the face of absolute possession, love itself perverted into the most dangerous weapon of all. In the lamplight that revealed everything while concealing nothing, the comfortable certainties of domestic life had been forever altered by the recognition that the deepest loyalties, when twisted by the desire to control rather than cherish, could become the instruments of their own destruction. The last mask of Venice had indeed concealed the darkest heart, and the performance had concluded not with applause but with the quiet horror of understanding that some truths, once revealed, can never be forgotten or forgiven. The drawing-room at Windermere held its breath in the aftermath of Miss Jesson's quiet confession, the fire's gentle crackling the only sound to disturb a silence weighted with 15 years of devotion, revealed in its true, terrible form. Lady Constance remained motionless in her chair, her silver hair catching the lamplight as she gazed at the woman who had been her confidant with an expression that held no anger, only a profound bewilderment that seemed to age her before their eyes. The betrayal was not of trust but of understanding itself. The recognition that love, when it sought to control rather than cherish, could transform the most devoted service into the most dangerous possession. Alleyn moved toward the telephone with the measured discretion that such moments required, arranging for transportation with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all his professional duties. There would be no dramatic flourishes, no harsh pronouncements, only the soft murmur of official language and the promise of a motor car that would arrive without sirens or spectacle, respecting the dignity that Windermere demanded even in its darkest hour. Miss Jesson rose when he returned, positioning herself by the piano with her hands clasped before her, in a gesture that spoke of acceptance rather than resignation. She offered Lady Constance the slightest of nods, not an apology, for she had acted according to her own moral calculus, but an acknowledgment of the path she had chosen and its inevitable destination. Lady Constance in response managed a tremulous smile that held within it the complex recognition of a bond that remained powerful even in its shattering. Formalities that followed unfolded with particular grace. Miss Jesson submitted to the necessary procedures with the same composed attention she had brought to all her duties, requesting only that she be permitted to complete the morning's flower arrangements, a final service that revealed habits so deeply ingrained that even disgrace could not entirely erase them. When the motor arrived, she departed with quiet dignity, her small case and carefully folded letters the only evidence of a life that had been dedicated entirely to another's welfare. Sir Maurice, who had retreated into the shadows near the French doors, seemed to diminish before their eyes. His Venetian indiscretions, which had catalysed this tragedy, now appeared as the careless actions of a man whose charm had been his currency, and whose thoughtlessness had cost more than he could ever comprehend. He would face no legal consequences, but the social erosion had already begun, his welcome in such houses permanently withdrawn, his elegant lifestyle requiring reconstruction in less forgiving circumstances. Giles gathered his abandoned script with trembling hands, the pages bearing witness to how thoroughly reality had overtaken theatrical invention. The themes of The Last Masque of Venice now seemed to mock their creator, their artistic profundity swallowed by brutal reality. The charitable gala would be cancelled, the amateur theatrical society quietly disbanded, the costumes from Venice returned to their origins with thanks but no explanation. His unwitting contribution to the tragedy would likely shape both his art and his understanding for years to come. In the days that followed, Windermere gradually accommodated itself to the absence of Miss Jesson's organising presence. Lady Constance moved through her familiar landscape with the careful attention of one learning to navigate territory that had been fundamentally altered, taking up tasks that other hands had managed for 15 years. The roses on the mantelpiece were replaced by chrysanthemums, their bronze and yellow faces turned toward the weakening sun with the patient attention that autumn flowers bring to their brief season. Dr. Meadows completed his formal examination with thorough attention, his findings confirming what careful observation had revealed. "The precision troubles me most," he confided to Alleyn. "This was not passion but calculation, executed with technical competence that suggests long contemplation rather than sudden impulse." The morning room was closed and would remain so, its pier glass reflecting nothing more than empty chairs and the memory of tragedy. On his final morning at Windermere, Alleyn walked through gardens where October had painted the ancient oaks in shades of gold and russet. The morning air carried that particular clarity which comes after revelation, when secrets have been exposed to daylight and can no longer poison the atmosphere with their hidden presence. Yet he understood that some truths, once revealed, cast shadows that no subsequent illumination can entirely dispel. "Inspector," Lady Constance said as he prepared to depart, "I find myself wondering whether Viola was right, whether some truths are indeed too harsh for generous hearts to bear. The knowledge of what she did and why has changed something fundamental in my understanding of human nature." Alleyn considered her words with appropriate gravity. Perhaps the most important truth is that love itself, when it seeks to control rather than cherish, becomes something other than love. Miss Jesson's devotion was real, but it had transformed into possession so complete that it could not tolerate any threat, even the threat of knowledge that might cause temporary pain. As his car drew away from Windermere's ancient facade, Alleyn reflected on the curious modesty with which truth presents itself. It does not stride or declaim, but settles like dust into the exact places that reveal the shape of things. The masks from Venice had indeed concealed dark hearts, but the darkest heart had belonged not to the victim, but to the killer, someone whose love had been so absolute that it had become indistinguishable from tyranny, whose service had been so complete that it had transformed into the most dangerous form of ownership. The ancient house settled back into its familiar rhythms, forever changed by the recognition that the deepest loyalties, when corrupted by the desire to control rather than protect, could become the instruments of their own destruction. In the October light that revealed everything while concealing nothing, the comfortable certainties of domestic life had been permanently altered by the understanding that love itself, in its most extreme manifestation, could become the most dangerous weapon of all. The performance at Windermere had ended without applause, leaving only the quiet knowledge that even in the best-run houses, the last mask offers no defence against the look that truly sees.